Good evening, everyone. I'm here to give you your lecture for the reproductive and the respiratory system. I am going to try to expedite things, so hopefully you already have the worksheet that I gave you or the study sheet that I gave you in last class, as well as the PowerPoint presentations up and available. As far as having your textbook, you can use your textbook as a reference, but a lot of the information that is in both the reproductive systems as well as the respiratory system, there's a lot of it, and we don't need to focus on the majority of it. So I try to simplify everything by just putting it into the study guide. So I'm going to start with the reproductive system, and I'm going to be going from the study sheet. However, you should also make sure that you review the PowerPoint presentation. It gives you more of just an outline and the general information you need to know. And the study guide reinforces that. So I just happen to have that right here with me and not the PowerPoint presentation, but please make sure you review that as well. The important thing to know about the reproductive systems that you need to focus on are the various organs within the reproductive system, their functions, and what our reproductive system is responsible for doing. Now, the good thing about the reproductive system is that many of us, or all of us, are one gender or the other. So we typically know a lot of the organs that we have in that particular system. We might not know all the functions, but we do at least have a general idea of the organs within the reproductive system. So in the PowerPoint presentation, it goes over the functions of the reproductive system as well as on the study sheet. And you'll notice that it lists them as, number one, the responsibility of the reproductive system to produce gametes. Now, when we were in chapter, I believe it was chapter 3, when we were talking about the parts of the cell and how the cell actually reproduces or makes more of itself, we talked about a process called mitosis. There were 4 stages to mitosis, which were prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Interphase was part of the cell cycle, but it's not part of cellular division. So that's why we do not include it in mitosis. Mitosis is the cellular division of normal body cells that we refer to as autosomes. And back then, I mentioned the fact that only normal, regular body cells like muscle cells and skin cells, so on and so forth, undergo that type of division, but there was something different for the gametes. Well, fast forward to where we are now, and we are actually introducing the term gametes. Gametes are referring to the sex cells, and we're referring to particularly either the egg, which is also known as the ovum, plural, ova, and sperm, sometimes referred to as spermatozoa or spermatids. Those are the gametes, and they undergo a process of division called meiosis. Meiosis is the cellular division of the gametes. And there are 2 types, since we've got 2 different types of gametes. We have spermatogenesis, and if you actually break that word down, genesis means the beginning of, spermato means sperm, so it's actually the beginning of the production of sperm. And we also have oogenesis or oogenesis, which is the process of cellular division for an egg. Now, both of these are types of mitosis, but it's further delineated specific to each individual gamete. Now, the difference between mitosis and meiosis is that at the end of mitosis, we are looking at 2 what were referred to as daughter cells that are identical to the original parent cell. So if the parent cell had 4 chromosomes, then the daughter cells have 4 chromosomes. If the parent cell had 8, then the daughter cells had 8. When we look at the process of meiosis, the cellular division, it actually undergoes 2 meiotic divisions. The first meiotic division, everything is referred to as a 1, as in prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1. And that is because if we start out, let's say, with 4 chromosomes within the cell, those 4 chromosomes will then split, and then at the end of the first stages of meiosis, or meiosis 1, we have now reduced that one cell into two cells, but it's not identical to the parent. Instead of having four chromosomes as the parent did, those two cells at the end of meiosis 1 each have two. So now we've reduced it by half. Starting out as 4, these now have 2. Therefore, the original parent cell is referred to as being diploid, as in 2n, twice the number. But the cells that it's reduced to, and there's a second meiotic division that occurs, in which these two individual cells then split into two. And they will also have half of the number of chromosomes of these two cells. So we start with 4 that reduce to 2. And then the second meiotic division occurs. So we have prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, telophase 2. And at the end of that, we would end up with 4 cells that now only have 1 chromosome each. So if you're trying to wrap your mind around that, think of taking 4 divided by 2 and getting 2. And then you take 2 divided by 2 and getting 1. So each individual cell now has 1 chromosome. So therefore, you can see that it went from a diploid number, which is 2n, to what is referred to as a haploid number, which is just n. So it's been reduced by the first meiotic division and then the second meiotic division. At the end of spermatogenesis, which is the production of the cell, of the sperm cells, at the end of it, we end up with 4 spermatozoa, or 4 sperm cells. Same thing. Now, at the end of oogenesis, or oogenesis, we end up with 4 of something, but we will note that there's a slight difference. And for that, I'm going to get my whiteboard so that I can show you. Still have something up there from the last one. Okay, so we've already identified the fact that at the end of spermatogenesis, we end up with 4 sperm cells. Cool. So now let's look here. We've got the cell that has, let's see, 4 chromosomes. That's the original. This is 2n. After it undergoes the first meiotic division, and that's the prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase 1, we end up with a reduction down to 2. But remember, in meiosis, be it spermatogenesis or oogenesis, we have the other reduction that will leave us with this type of process. Now you notice I'm drawing one larger, and that's because this large end product is the ovum or the egg. These 3 are what are referred to as polar bodies. The polar bodies are very small, and they're not viable. So as a result, the ovum or the egg will survive while the polar bodies actually disintegrate. So we still end up with 4 cells at the end of meiosis. However, the only one that survives is the egg. The 3 polar bodies disintegrate. Okay, so there we have it. That was the first thing, producing the gametes. Next, they're responsible for maintaining the gametes. There are hormones that are secreted that make sure, or are intended to make sure, that the sperm cells are viable, living, and that the egg is also viable. Then our reproductive system is also responsible for transporting the gametes. Okay, so the reproductive system has made these cells. Now, what does it do with them? Well, the egg in the woman will travel, And same thing, the sperm in the men, first they're made, they're stored, and eventually once they're ejaculated, they also have the ability to travel. So they're transporting those particular gametes. And in the woman, the next idea is that there's the maintenance of the zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg. So our reproductive system is responsible for maintaining that zygote. Once the zygote has been maintained, if it further develops into a fetus, then the woman's body is also responsible for maintaining the fetus during the gestation period. And then finally, our reproductive system is responsible for producing the hormones. All of us have the hormones that are listed: estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. The predominant female hormones are our progesterone and estrogen, while the predominant male hormone is testosterone. If either gender has more of the other hormone that's predominant in the other gender, then they will have some of the characteristics that come along with that particular hormone. For example, women that have excessive testosterone may also develop excessive facial hair. They may have deeper voices. The muscular development may be different or may be greater. So these are things, the characteristics that come along with increased levels of testosterone. And vice versa for the men. If they have more progesterone or estrogen, there are other characteristics that develop inside of them, that develop with the male, such as enlarged breast, maybe changes in the pitch of voice, so on and so forth. Okay, so if you're looking at your study sheet, it goes into the differences between mitosis and meiosis, which I further explained. And then we go immediately into the male reproductive system, which is the first part of the PowerPoint presentation as well. And identifying the various structures. And the diagram on the study sheet is very good. And you can, if you might, I don't know if you can see all the small writing, but you should be able to identify some of it. If not, make sure you go back to the PowerPoint presentation, because there is an anterior view of the male reproductive system that you should be able to see. But we're going to outline the various parts of the male reproductive system to make sure that you understand. The testes. Testes are located within the scrotal sac. The scrotal sac is actually exterior or on the outside of the body, and they are round ovoid structures that are responsible, number one, for producing the sperm as well as producing the male predominant hormone, which is testosterone. That is its job. Right on top of the testes inside of the scrotum sac, you will notice a little, it kind of, in the diagram on the study sheet, it looks more like a, to me, it looks like looking at somebody from the side view, and it's like their hairline and their profile. But if you look at it in the PowerPoint presentation, it looks like a little hat or a cap sitting on top of the testes. This is the epididymis. The epididymis is responsible for storing the sperm until it needs to be used or ejaculated. Once it has been ejaculated, it travels through that muscular tube that's attached to the epididymis called the spermatic ducts. The spermatic ducts are also referred to as vas deferens, either one, they're synonymous. And that's the way that the sperm can travel from the epididymis up through the muscular tube and eventually through the prostate and out through the urethra. We already know what the urethra is because we identified that when we were discussing the urinary system. So not only is the urethra responsible for allowing urine to pass from the urinary bladder to the outside, but it's also responsible for allowing semen to pass from the spermatic ducts out through the to the outside as well. The prostate gland lies just superior to the penile shaft, and it's responsible for secreting an alkaline fluid. Alkaline, remember, is on the pH scale anything greater than 7, and the alkaline fluid is designed to enhance sperm motility, because when the sperm are released through the urethra into the vagina of the female, those sperm have to travel to actually try to meet with the egg at the site of fertilization. The site of fertilization is within the fallopian tubes. And if you look at the diagram, you will note that that's a pretty decent amount of distance if you are a microscopic sperm cell to have to travel. So the prostate is designed to increase sperm motility with the alkaline fluid. All right. And then we have the penis, which is the external excitatory organ. It enters the vagina as well as allows urine to pass through the urethra, and it completely surrounds the urethra. When it enters the vagina, and like I said, the sperm is ejaculated, depending on the length of the penis will determine how far into the vaginal canal the penis actually sits, because the cervix, which is the lower 1/3 of the uterus, is where the sperm actually has to pass through in order to gain entry into the uterus and finally to the fallopian tube. So as we see, male reproductive system went relatively quickly. I wish I could say the same about the female reproductive system, but we have a few more organs that we need to identify. So the inclusive structures include the ovaries, uterine and fallopian tubes, can also be referred to as the oviduct, the uterus, vagina, external genitalia, and the breast or mammary glands. The main responsibility of the ovaries. The ovaries have the job that the testes do in the male. They are responsible for actually producing the gamete. They are responsible for producing the eggs. And if you look at the PowerPoint presentation, you will note that you can see several eggs within the ovary, but only one is released into the fallopian tube. Inside the fallopian tube, we have what are called cilia, and you know cilia to be hair. But right at the end of it, we have some finger-like projections that are kind of sitting there waiting for the egg to be released from the ovary. And when it is, those finger-like projections that are called fimbriae help to coax the egg, well, you know, it needs a little bit of help to get from the ovary into the fallopian tube. Once in the fallopian tube, the cilia kind of help to move it along through the tube. The fallopian tube can also be called the uterine tube. It can also be called the oviduct. It's the primary site of fertilization, but that's not always where it occurs. It can occur too far down the fallopian tube, and ideally, once the egg is fertilized and becomes the zygote, it's supposed to implant in the lining of the uterus in order to continue with the gestation period and eventually become a fetus. But there are times when things happen, and the egg could be fertilized in the site of fertilization and implant inside of the fallopian tube. That we refer to as an ectopic pregnancy. Sometimes that's also referred to as a tubular pregnancy, which can be detrimental for the fetus as well as the mother. Or if it's fertilized too far down and the cells don't have the opportunity to proliferate as they need to, then it may be that the egg doesn't have a chance to implant into the lining of the fetus, into the line of the uterus in time. Fetus does not develop, therefore the egg is passed out through menstruation. Okay, the uterus. The uterus is actually a very hollow muscular organ. It's got three layers to it. It's got the endometrium, which is the inner layer. The myometrium on the PowerPoint, it shows you it's the thicker muscular layer, and it's completely surrounded by what's called the perimetrium. It has the ballooning portion of it, just like when we talked in the digestive system about the stomach having a ballooning portion. They both have the same name. That ballooning portion is called the fundus. The greatest region of the uterus is referred to as the body, and the lower 1/3 of the uterus is referred to the cervix. The cervix is normally supposed to be closed during gestation. However, there are times where it will slightly dilate, which means open. And in that case, if the female is pregnant, then she could run the risk of losing the fetus, because that open cervix would allow for the fetus or the embryo to pass through, thus turning into or becoming a miscarriage. Excuse the dog scratching at the door. Okay. The vagina is actually the passageway from the cervix to the outside, sometimes referred to as part of the birth canal. So once the 9 months have passed, or whatever amount of time, it's supposed to be a gestation period of about 9 months, then the cervix will dilate, thus allowing, don't let her in, thus allowing the see, I'm sorry about this. That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. Just go. Thus allowing the lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. I think I was talking about the birth canal. Thus allowing, once the cervix has dilated, allowing the fetus to pass from the inside through the birth canal outside. External genitalia include labia. Labia obviously means lip. There's a labia majora, which is the outer lip, and labia minora, which is the inside. And they both are designed to help protect the reproductive organs, particularly the vagina and the clitoris. The clitoris is actually that reproductive organ that initially we're all the same up until about 9 weeks of gestation. And then if that clitoris continues to further develop, then it will develop into the penis. If it does not, then it will stay as is, and the gender of the offspring of the child would be female. There are hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodites have incompletely or underdeveloped male and female reproductive organs. All right. I'm looking at the study sheet, and from what I can tell, that completes the information in regard to the reproductive system. Science, yes. Okay, so if you have any further questions about that, be sure to send me an email, let me know, and I will answer any questions that you have. If you have any, please make sure that you send them to me prior to Wednesday's class. And it will probably be in your best interest to send them to me prior to Wednesday, because on Wednesday I can't say that I will be able to answer any questions that you might have within a timely fashion to get back to you before you actually have your quiz. Okay, so now let's go on to the respiratory system. Breathing is something that I think many of us really take for granted. I've never really had any real respiratory problems, never suffered from allergies or asthma or anything of the like. However, my oldest son at 5 years old had some respiratory issues that it was unfamiliar territory to me. And I ended up having to rush him to CHKD. Well, the scenario was this. He was trying to explain to me that his stomach hurt. So when I hear stomach ache, I think digestive system. Maybe you got to go to the bathroom. Let's try and go to the bathroom, baby. Let's, all that good stuff. But he said, no, I don't have to go. But he kept complaining. So I just figured he didn't know what he was talking about, basically. So that evening, we go to sleep, and he wakes up in the wee hours of the morning calling my name, can barely breathe, and is still complaining of his stomach, about his stomach hurting. Well, when I looked at him and I looked at his stomach, I could see his diaphragm just vigorously contracting. So what he was trying to articulate to me wasn't necessarily that he had a stomach ache, but it was because his diaphragm was contracting so hard to try to force air into his lungs because he couldn't breathe well. He was having an asthma attack. I didn't know. I've never had asthma. None of that. And it was in September when it occurred. And what happens with him is that, and once I rushed him to CHKD, all of them, they explained everything to me, what was going on. They had to put him on a nebulizer, they had to give him a steroid, all this other good stuff that I had never seen before. What they told me was that he has seasonal allergies. These seasonal allergies that he had triggered the asthma attack. All of this was foreign to me. I mean, I knew what asthma was, I knew what allergies were, but I had never had one myself, nor had anyone in my family ever had those types of respiratory problems. So needless to say, it scared me to death. They gave him an inhaler, I had to bring the nebulizer home and all that good stuff. But needless to say, it only took that one event for me to be vigilant from that point on. So now that he's in high school and he plays football and he does all this other stuff, That inhaler, wherever he goes, I make sure it goes. And I say that because when I was in mortuary school, our secretary for the department had a daughter that went to a sleepover, 12 years old, left the inhaler at home, died at the sleepover. Unbelievable. So you best believe when he goes to play those JV football games and all that other stuff, I made sure, I'm like, make sure your trainer has your inhaler. Make sure the trainer has your inhaler. And he's the one that's like, oh, that's not cool. That's not cool. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want to have to do that. I said, better to make sure that the trainer has it than have your mother come running out on the field, holding up the inhaler, calling your name. I refuse. I refuse to have to deal with you passed out on the football field because you're trying to be cool. I said, you pick which one you want. Either you can have the trainer hold it, or you can have your mom running out on the field and standing there calling your name. So I guess you can figure which option he took. But anyway, so leading into the respiratory system, our respiratory system is designed to help us breathe. But we can find ourselves in some really peculiar environments at times where wherever we are, the air might not be as pure and as clean and as crisp as we need it to be. Because ideally, we want to be able to capture the oxygen. That's what we need. That's what our red blood cells need in order to help us to continue to function. Transporting that oxygen to the various organs within our system so that they can keep going, so that we can keep going. Because we know that the cells, the red blood cells, will take it to the tissue, which will be the blood. The tissue will take it to the various organs. The organs all function collectively and collaboratively together to make the organ system. And then finally, the organ systems working together make the organism go. But if we're in environments where we can't capture that oxygen, or there's not enough oxygen, then the process of ventilation can't occur. Ventilation is breathing. That's what it means. Respiration, which is also a process that we undergo, it's not breathing, but respiration is actually our body's exchange of oxygen with whatever is in the environment that we encounter. So where I'm sitting right now, my body is undergoing a respiration process because I mean, of course there's oxygen in here, but there are other gases in here as well. But my body is taking the time to capture the oxygen, which is what I need. And every time I inhale, that's what I need. But whatever I don't need, particularly carbon dioxide, I exhale and I give that off. Well, I don't have any plants in this room, but I do have plants in my house because the plants will actually give off more oxygen. That's why we're always trying to save the trees, save the plants, plant a tree, do this, that, and the other, because they undergo a process called photosynthesis in which they make their own food. And all they need is a little bit of sunlight, some water, some carbon dioxide. They've got the chlorophyll inside of them already. They take all those things, work them together, and they end up making their own food. But at the end of photosynthesis, they give off oxygen, which is what we so desperately need. So that's the process of respiration, our body exchanging gases with the atmosphere or the environment in which we're in. Ventilation, the process of breathing. Now, in the PowerPoint presentation, it goes over the various mechanisms by which this is done. We have ventilation, which we have to breathe, get the various gases or whatever that's in the air in the environment that we're in. Then we move to external respiration. So once we've started the breathing process, that's through our nose, that's through our mouth. Then it moves directly, both of those organs are within the respiratory system. And then we move it to the specific organ that's going to be responsible for helping us to make that conversion of all the gases to get it down to the one gas that we need, which is oxygen. So external respiration is when the air in the atmosphere moves into our lungs. From that point, the lungs are like, okay, hey, got the air. What you want me to do with it? Red blood cells, y'all are in the blood. How you want me to get to it? get it to you. Those gases are then transported into the bloodstream. So they go from the lungs, which is the organ, and then it's transported to the tissue, which is the blood. Because remember, blood is a connective tissue. And inside of the blood, we have a process that will go on. This is called internal respiration. So now the blood has these gases. That's like, okay, got some oxygen here, got a little carbon dioxide too, got a little this, got a little that. Blood, what you want me to do? The internal respiration will then turn on and say, all right, it's got to move to the next level. So then from the blood, it's going to move to the specific cells that are responsible for transporting the oxygen. So from the organ, the lung, external, in there, transported to the tissue, which is blood, then transported to the internal respiration, which would be through the formed elements. Remember, there's plasma and there's formed elements, erythrocytes, leukocytes, thrombocytes. Okay, so the internal transports to the formed elements, and then finally cellular transport, cellular respiration is going to occur, because it's like, okay, formed elements, here are the gases. Which one of you needs them? And so finally the red blood cells say, hey, me, I'm the one. We're the ones that are responsible for transporting that oxygen. So for cellular respiration, what then occurs is that oxygen is moved to those red blood cells. The conversion takes place. The red blood cells then will take that oxygen to the various parts of the body that need the oxygen. And it's like, hey, but I got some carbon dioxide here. You don't need that. And what will happen is that entire process moves in the reverse. And we exhale the carbon dioxide. Inhale. Exhale. All of that goes on with every breath that you take. Now, that might not seem like much to you. But when I think about the fact that I don't have to think about breathing, and I don't have any types of problems that hinder my breathing mechanism, that's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome to me, to think that the human body can even do that. Now, I don't know if you get the same kind of thrill about stuff like that I do, but when I stop to think about it, with every breath that I take, I mean, like, as much as I'm talking right now, obviously my brain is going to need some oxygen, so I've got to grab whatever I can in this atmosphere that I'm in. My red blood cells are like, can you please hurry up and get us some oxygen, because she is talking way too fast for me, and I got to get it up there so she can continue to remember what it is she's supposed to say. That's what our body does. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, but it moved into the lungs, and how did all that get like that? I'm going to tell you right now. So let's start looking at the various organs and their functions. So first thing I said was something about the nose, and yeah, we got the mouth too. But the nose is responsible for actually warming and filtering the air, because sometimes we can find ourselves in places where there's a lot of wind, there's a lot of dust, there's a lot of pollen, there's a lot of whatever. And so inside of our nose, we have hairs that are responsible for kind of being a filter. Just like a filter in your house traps some of the particles that don't need to go into the ventilation system. Same deal here. Same deal here. Our nose will trap those particles that could potentially clog up the system. Our mouth, well, if you can't breathe through your nose, what do? You breathe through your mouth. You can still capture the oxygen necessary. The nasal cavity. Nasal cavity is a space behind our nose. If we were able to take the nose off, excuse me, we would see a hollow cavity. There's a long, thin bone in the middle, but you should remember what the name of that bone is. It's the vomer. And on top of the vomer, we have the septum. The septum sits on top. It's made of hyaline cartilage. It divides our nasal cavity into a right and a left nostril. In addition to that, make sure you go back and recall what sinuses are. There's spaces in some of the bones. They're designed to reduce the weight of the skull. We have sinuses within the frontal bone, the maxillary bones here, sphenoid and ethmoid. That's why if we have some type of sinus infection or we have a sinus headache, those are the regions that it hurts. We also have our pharynx, which is referred to as our throat. It has 3 regions to it, and if you look in the PowerPoint presentation, you will notice that those regions don't have any defining or definitive line. However, the most superior region, they're named according to the anatomical structures that they're nearest. So the most superior region will be the nasopharynx. Directly behind our tongue at the back of the oral cavity is the oropharynx. And the most inferior portion of that would be the laryngeopharynx. But we should kind of recall that from the digestive system because we identified the throat in the digestive system as well. However, we really didn't talk about the voice box, which is the larynx. And the voice box actually has cords inside of it. And those cords vibrate when the air passes over them. If, for whatever reason, those cords become inflamed, they can't vibrate properly, and we end up with a condition that's referred to as laryngitis. Once they are no longer inflamed, they go back down to size, the air can make them vibrate, and once again, we'll have our voice back. I think one time, we talked about it when I was talking about the digestive system, about the glottis and the epiglottis. Remember, the epiglottis is that flap that is designed to cover the windpipe, which is the trachea. Kind of looks like a vacuum cleaner hose. And the epiglottis is the flap that is designed to close or cover the opening of the trachea so that when you swallow, the food shuts down into the esophagus. We talked about that whole thing before, so I'm not going to go into it again. But I do want to make you remember, epiglottis is the flap, the glottis is the hole that covers the flap. The hole leads down to the trachea, which is our windpipe, and anything from the trachea superiorly is referred to the upper respiratory tract. Anything from the trachea inferiorly is the lower respiratory tract. So if you have a lower respiratory tract infection, you know that it's actually could possibly and potentially move into your bronchial tubes. Because off of the trachea, which has those cartilaginous rings, we've got these what look like branches, and they split. So the first split is called the primary bronchial tubes or the primary bronchi. You've got a right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus. They are the first portions that actually move into the lungs. Those primary bronchi will then split into secondary. The secondary will then split into tertiary, and the tertiary split into terminal. Now, when we think of terminal, a lot of times you think of terminal as being the end. A terminal disease is the last disease you're going to have. But the termination point there is not really saying that's the end of the bronchial tree, but it's just the end of that pathway before you actually move into the process of respiration. This is where the good stuff is getting ready to happen. So you go from trachea, primary splits to secondary, secondary splits to tertiary, tertiary splits to terminal. Bam! Now we're getting ready to move to the good stuff. The respiratory bronchioles are telling you, okay, this is where the gas exchange is about to occur because you got the word respiratory in there, respiratory bronchioles. Those respiratory bronchioles will take you to a passageway called the alveolar ducts. That's what a duct is. A duct is a passageway. So it's like, hey, respiratory bronchioles, I'm here to start that process, but I need the passageway in order to get to what is actually going to do what I needed to do. So from the respiratory bronchioles, we've got the alveolar ducts that will lead us to these things that look like bunches of grapes. And they're called alveolar sacs. And each one of those little grapes in that cluster is called an alveolus, plural alveoli. The alveoli, each individual little round grape, is a site of gas exchange in the respiratory system. Those alveoli, sites of gas exchange. That's where all that gas, the gas is passed in and out. Because they have pores, which kind of like the pores on our skin, allow our skin to kind of breathe, so to speak, and it also allows oil to be secreted as well as sweat and perspiration. Same thing with these alveoli. They have these pores, and their walls are so thin that they allow gases to pass right through? Well, back in another lecture, I remember talking about the fact that something called capillaries have walls that are very, very thin that allow gases to pass right through, because we talked about the fact that formaldehyde is a gas. It's not the fluid that permeates the tissue, it's the gas. So, Jones, can you link all this together for me? I sure can. Primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary, tertiary to terminal. Bam. Time to hit that respiratory tract. Respiratory bronchioles to the passageway, the alveolar ducts. The alveolar duct will take you to the alveolar sacs. Each alveolar sac, if you look in the other PowerPoint presentation, you will notice that there's a network of vessels that completely surround it, engulf it. Some of it is red, some of it is blue. Those are the capillaries. Capillaries have those walls that are so thin that they also let gases pass through. Remember when we talked about the breathing mechanism in the process, we said that it goes to the blood, and that's the transport, and then eventually it goes directly to the cells that have the oxygen. Well, if I surround each one of these alveolar clusters, or these alveolar sacs, and these capillaries that have the walls that are so thin, and the alveoli have the walls that are so thin, well, both of them would allow for the exchange of gases. The arteries are red, and so something just slightly smaller than an artery is called an arteriole, and then those arterioles get even smaller, and then there are the capillaries. And then we've got the veins that are blue with the deoxygenated blood. Something slightly smaller than a vein is a venule, and then the venules become capillaries. And in one of those diagrams, you can even see where one side is red, the other side is blue, but kind of in the middle, you have like a light, faint purple, because that's where the transition occurs from the oxygenated to the deoxygenated blood. And it completely engulfs these alveolar sacs, and so it allows the blood to get those gases to pass right through into the alveolar sacs. And then the alveolar sacs will pass it in the way that it needs to go. And we will do what? Exhale. Incredible. Incredibly. So that's the entire process of the bronchial tree. That's how it actually gets from the outside down into the lower respiratory tract, through the bronchial tree, finally to the site of gas exchange, and back out the other way. Okay, so after we've done that, the one thing we really haven't talked about, and one of the main organs that we think about when we talk about the respiratory system, those are the lungs. They're kind of cone-shaped. The right lung has 3 lobes. The left lung has 2. So that's the superior, middle, and inferior on the right. Superior and inferior on the left. But the left lung has the cardiac impression, which is where the heart rests. And if you look at the diagram in the PowerPoint presentation, you can clearly see what almost looks like a notch, and that's where the heart lies. All right. I think that covers everything. Make sure you look at the study guide and kind of couple it and channel it, or just kind of make the comparison with the information that's in the PowerPoint presentation. Use your textbook as a guide and a reference as well. And if you have any questions, make sure that you get them to me, send them to me via email, and I'll respond to them as quickly as I can. And be prepared to take this quiz on Wednesday when you come to class, and then we will carry on from there. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for all the wonderful birthday wishes. I hope you had a happy Veterans Day, and I will see you soon. Have a great one.